In this episode, I'm joined by Gregg Glass, whisky maker at the Dalmore. He works alongside Richard Paterson, the master blender of Dalmore, and also on the other single malts that come under the White and Mackay group of brands. So, Greg, lovely to see you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, I know that we've had a lot of good conversations in the past about all different areas of whiskey and particularly maturation and wood. And I know that this particular conversation you can't really talk about Dalmore without talking about casks and wood. So I'm looking forward to jumping into that. Now, I think something that's probably worth starting off with is, I mentioned Richard Paterson a moment ago, the very famous master blender of Dalmore, known as the Nose. Now, you get to work alongside him every day, developing new products for the Dalmore and its sister distilleries. So, how did you come to have this very special role?
I'm very fortunate. I started in the industry just over 20 years ago. So in my late teens, I started working at different distilleries. In actual fact, in my early 20s, I spent a time working at the Dalmore itself, which was the first time that I came across Richard as he was assessing casks in the warehousing there. And so from an early age, sort of Richard was very much an inspiration to me in terms of his elements of perfection within creating such a great whiskey as the Dalmore. And then I progressed through the industry in different areas. I started off as an assistant blender and whiskey maker up to full whiskey maker, and I joined Richard around 4 years ago. So we've been working together very closely since then. So very fortunate. As many of you will know, he's really a legend in the industry, and largely because of his approach to expertise at different areas in the industry, and particularly he's very famous for what he's done with the Dalmore in terms of creating a legacy that will go on for many centuries to come, I think.
So you've got this fantastic opportunity to work alongside one of the sort of the greats of the industry and with spirit from one of the most famous distilleries in the industry as well.
Absolutely, yeah. The Dalmore was founded in 1839, and even back in its early days, it was really seen as a pioneer in terms of quality of liquid that was produced. And Richard has been with the company for over 50 years now, and the history of the distillery goes back almost 180 years. So he's been a major part of being a custodian for what's happened at the distillery, but also a lot of work in the realms of innovation and looking at different approaches to whiskey making too.
Now, I've had the pleasure of dropping by the Dalmore Distillery on a number of occasions, and I remember before my first visit, I'd read descriptions about how you obviously have to drive very far north to even get into the right neck of the woods. You're north of Inverness, and you come down when you're getting close. You come down this sort of this tree lined lane, and then everything, and you start seeing warehouses, and then everything opens up in front of you, and you just have this beautiful expanse of water in front of you. And I remember imagining what this would be like because I hadn't seen any pictures at the time. And it's one of those ones where the descriptions sound good, but then when you actually visit for the first time, it's actually more spectacular than it's cracked up to be, which is a nice surprise. So tell me a little bit more about that local area that Dalmore sits in.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, the Dalmore Distillery is located just north of Inverness, and there's a peninsula just north of Inverness, northeast of Inverness, called the Black Isle. And the Dalmore Distillery sits opposite that on the other side of what's called the Cromarty Firth. So it's very much a beautiful area. The Dalmore means big meadowland, big land and it's a very famous place for its agriculture. So the growing of barley, the quality of the water sources. Loch Moray is our water source there. So it's really formed as part of the landscape, and I would classify the Dalmores almost being like an old school Highland character. It really does stand apart out there in the whiskey world, and I think that's partly down to really the feeling that you get. There, people talk about terroir within wine, and it's debatable within terroir within the whiskey world, but certainly it's of its place and really is unique as a distillery.
Well, I think unique is definitely the word when it comes to Dalmore. I mean, I remember the first time I toured it. It's the setup is it's definitely different, isn't it? I mean, the setup is wildly different from what people might expect. Other than the fact that there's the standard processes that one would that you'd see in any distillery, like milling and mashing and fermentation and distillation and copper pot stills. But there are a lot of elements there that are wildly different from the norm. So take me through the production process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the production that we're doing at the distillery, it really does keep very true to how we've traditionally done things there, and that's been morphed through the 180 years of experience. Probably one of the most unique aspects, certainly of the spirit production, is in our still house. We have very unusual bulbous stills there. And as well as that, we also have a water jacket on our sets of spirit stills as well. We have also different sized stills within there. So in actual fact, the creation of the spirit is very much a hands-on process. It's quite different from most distilleries, but what we're looking for is to retain that as it were old school Highland spirit character that's got a lot of weight. There's a lot of fruit characteristics, dark fruit characteristics, and maltiness that's within there, which again allows us to stand out quite significantly in terms of the production process. But really that production process has been handed down through generations and generations. So as I say, 1839 is when the distillery was founded, but it was really the 1860s with the Mackenzie brothers who came in, Andrew Mackenzie in particular, who really focused very heavily on promoting the Dalmore outside there and made some changes in terms of the production, but staying true to that sort of older style of Highland malt.
So you mentioned there the unusual shape of the stills, the fact that they're different sizes, and the fact that they've got this water jacket. Now let's start with the fact that you've got different size stills. I think most people that have started sort of looking into the whiskey production process or the new make production process would understand that generally, if you might think if you've got different sizes of stills or different shapes of stills, you're going to get slightly different spirits out of them. So how does that then all come together to create the Dalmore new make?
So what we're able to do is we unite and we harmonise these different spirits that are coming from the different size stills to create, if you like, a uniform style, but that's been born out of the uniqueness from each of those sets of stills. So it's very unusual because most of the time you'll mimic absolutely everything with the shape and the size of the stills as much as possible. So that forms part of just the history of the distillery, having different sizes of stills that have come from different eras and different times. Some parts of the stills going back to the late 1800s, even today. So it's sort of formed through an iterative process of our whiskey making process there, but also it's very much a manual process. So the stillman is really key to the production process that we have there.
Excellent. And then you also mentioned the water jacket that you have on some of the stills. And now that's something that I don't know, maybe even 10 years ago, you probably would have only been able to find in a couple of distilleries in Scotland. Funnily enough, also a similar one at Dalmore's sister distillery at Feta Cairn, although of a slightly different design. Now, some new distilleries that are out there that have just been built in the last couple of years are starting to introduce these water jackets again. And I think it's quite funny that you've got this, this very historic distillery in Dalmore that's just doing things the way that it's always kind of done them, and then some of these old Victorian technological innovations are starting to be adopted again by the latest wave of distillers. So, why would somebody want to use a water jacket in the first place?
So there's a number of reasons, but one of the main reason is what we call reflux. So what happens, as many people know, is you've got your still and you heat up your basic beer that's about 8% alcohol for the first distillation. In the second distillation, you then want to refine the selection of the spirit, and you'll heat up the alcohol in the bottom of the still, and the vapors will rise and then go across for condensation. And what we do is in the top of the still, we've actually got a section where there's some water that's in the top here. There's cold water. And what that does is it starts to pre-condense some of those alcohol vapors and the flavors as well. So what you find is some of the heavier elements will drop back down into the still because it started to condense, and some of them will go over the still. So generally speaking, having a water jacket, depending on the temperature of the water, for example, will promote a slightly lighter style of spirit. But because we've got these big bulbous stills, then we're balancing that heavy weight also with copper contact, because you can get more contact with the copper when you have a water jacket, and that helps to refine the spirit even more. So yeah, it's very unusual to have water jackets, and it's all part of sort of our uniqueness in terms of our spirit production at the distillery. And then when you go outside the distillery, we have external condensers which are horizontal rather than vertical, which has mimicked some of our previous production practices in the past as well. So there's a lot of these nuances, and I think Dalmore has many of them rather than just one individual thing. But certainly the distillation, it really promotes that unique Highland style, which for a whiskey maker is stunning. It's a unique character to use, and certainly back in the late 1800s, even into the early 1900s, Dalmore was highly respected within the blending industry as well. These days we focus a lot more on the Dalmore as a single malt, but really it was highly prized, and also for Richard as well in his path through being master distiller and master blender for the Dalmore. He also used to utilize that as a component within blended whiskey as well, to give real charm and weight and dimension too.
So you've talked about this quirky production process and this what you call a classic Highland character. But if you were nosing the new make, how would you characterize it? You get some whiskies are described, some new makes, sorry, are described as waxy, some green grassy, some fruity. How would you, which category would you say that Dalmore fits into?
So you've certainly got the heavyweight maltiness to it, but also there's some key indicators of when we go into the maturation process that are actually within the spirit itself. So you get beautiful, rich fruit characteristics. You get some citrusy notes, so almost like Seville orange peel you get within there, and a beautiful sort of creaminess that comes through in the new make. But really it stands out. For myself and Richard, we're nosing hundreds and even thousands of new make samples, not only from our own distilleries but many others, and really you can pick this out very easily amongst that crowd of the many distilleries. So really that spirit has been nurtured by our distillery teams and Richard over many decades, and it's great to be able to retain that style, because as you say, many new distilleries are looking to almost replicate some of the adaptability of a style like that. I find it really fascinating that people are going back to some of these traditional practices that were developed over decades and really revisiting them and checking them out and how they can be applied to whiskey making today and distilling today.
Exactly, I think it's wonderful. There was, when you look back through old books about whiskey, you can see that there was, this huge amount of innovation that went on during the Victorian era, where technology was really being embraced, and it's easy to sort of characterize it as, those Victorians with their steampunk, everything clockwork and everything running on steam, but they really, there is truth to that stereotype. You only need to look through some of the things that were developed, in that era to either to help with, as they develop their understanding of distillation, things like water jackets, or in malting, things like different sort of innovations in malting and moving away from floor malting to drum maltings and things like that. It's incredible that over the years these innovations were embraced, but then almost when it kind of got to the, I don't know, the 60s and the 70s, there was almost maybe a cynicism about some of these extra things, and there was almost this, even though there was this big boom in builds, it was this move to, well, let's be much more uniform, and let's do things in very clean cut ways and have everything very consistent and replicated, and it's nice to see now that we're having this new renaissance, that people are starting to say, well, actually, there's room for both.
Yeah, absolutely, and for Richard and I, as whiskey makers, a shared passion of ours is history, reading, going back to the documents, and strangely, just this week, we've actually been speaking to a local university that we work with in terms of maintaining our archives of Dalmore, including the old ledgers and production reports. And we still use these today as inspiration for our whiskey making of the future. So these are real pieces of history. I mean, part of the history of the Dalmore, again, beginning in 1839 with Sir Alexander Matheson having founded it, but largely there were tenant distillers who would come in and look after the distillery. And then in 1867, we had the Mackenzies then become involved in the running of the distillery, and then eventually the ownership. And the Mackenzie family are really an important family within the history of the Dalmore. There were almost 100 years of 3 generations of the Mackenzie family, and even the most recent of those, post the Second World War, who had really innovated in terms of some of the malting procedures with Saladin boxes. We're getting technical here, but some of the more modern technology for that. So that's Hack Mackenzie, quite a famous person locally there, and very well respected managing director of the Dalmore, and managing the distillery itself. So the Mackenzie family also play an important link in our bottles today. So even when you pick up a bottle of the Dalmore, you'll see this beautiful stag's head right there. And that is actually the crest of the Mackenzie family, and that harks back to King Alexander III, who was rescued from a charging stag by Colin Fitzgerald, who was chieftain of the Mackenzies. And King Alexander actually then allowed the use of the 12-pointer royal stag onto the bottles. So what I love about, even today, it's harking back to our origins way back then. So it's one question we get quite often is, why do you have that beautiful stag's head on there? And that's actually linked back to the Mackenzie family, who were important in styling the spirit, let alone anything else. And that still remains on our bottles today.
So we've talked about the, how you end up with this classic Highland spirit, but then something that that Dalmore's very famous for is the incredible variety of different cask types that get used, and particularly the different types of wine cask and fortified wine cask as well, which is something that we'll be discussing in more depth when we get to our tasting of the port wood. So, talk me through a little bit about Dalmore's general wood policy. What is the approach to maturation?
So well, again, because we're dealing with such a unique spirit style, we're just as unique in terms of what our maturation philosophy and policy is, but largely because we have this beautiful, weighty, fruity spirit, then what we need to do is be very careful with how we partner the right type of cask. Now, when we talk about a cask, we talk about the size of the cask, for example. We talk about the wood type, which can give an influence. Predominantly, we talk about American and European oak, but also importantly is what that cask has been used for before. Now, that can be bourbon, sherry, port, for example. What we typically do with our Dalmore spirit is that we typically what we do with the Dalmore spirit is we start its life in American white oak, so we give it as much of a good start as possible, and that allows the refinement of the spirit. We then go on to what we call a cask enhancement or finishing process thereafter, and we'll do that for a number of years. So we'll start the life out maybe for the first decade or maybe a couple of decades in American white oak, and then transfer that whiskey into hand-selected ex-wine or ex-fortified wine or even another spirit style of cask as well. So what we're doing there is we're layering different qualities and flavors into our particular recipe. So that's really important for us. It gives us the right partner to the spirit style that we're creating, but also adding different dimensions and picking out different dimensions. I mentioned a little bit about the spirit style, that there's a lot of fruit characteristics, for example, citrusy notes that actually come through in the spirit itself. And we can then elevate that, we can enhance that with different elements, different types of sherry, for example. And sherry is an important part of our story at the Dalmore, particularly with partnerships with producers, for example, González Bias in Spain, in Jerez, who we've sourced casks for over 100 years at the Dalmore Distillery, and really that's about selecting and dedicating the thought process and in flavour development, not just in the spirit, but what it's going to be resting in for many, many decades to come, sometimes well over 50 years on occasion.
Exactly. So you've got this incredible variety of different cask types. Now, I think we'll probably get to talking a little bit about sherry later on, but for now, let's start talking about this Portwood Reserve that we're going to be tasting today. I think it's fair to say that of all the cask types that are sort of part of maybe the traditional styles of maturation within Scotch whisky, port casks are perhaps the least understood generally, and I suppose that's for a few reasons. I think the port industry itself, even if you're an active drinker of port, you probably wouldn't know much about the production process unless you were really into your wine. I don't think I think it's fair to say that they don't tend to shout too much about their production process, even in the same way that perhaps the sherry industry does. I think most people, they think of sherry, they kind of have an image in their mind of Soleras and casks stacked on top of each other. There's some inkling there, but perhaps with port, I think most people wouldn't have much of an image that comes to mind. They probably know that they drink port after dinner with cheese, maybe at Christmas, but beyond that, it's perhaps loved but misunderstood. So when we're talking about port casks, what exactly are they? What kind of size are they? What kind of oak are they made from? And then what kinds of port are you using? Were in these casks before they were used to mature Dalmore?
Yeah, absolutely. So port, it's a fascinating world, and for those who are sherry lovers who haven't really gone a little bit further out to have a look, it's worthwhile because there are some subtle connections there, and some of the sherry houses were also involved in the production of port. So there was sort of cross fertilization of ideas and production, but essentially port is a fortified wine, and really the what you're trying to capture with that is the vibrancy of the raw ingredients and the wine itself, the grapes themselves. So you tend to find that often that fortification can happen earlier in the process than it would necessarily for sherry production. So generally you have three different styles of port. You have a ruby, a tawny, and then a vintage sets of ports. Now, generally speaking, that ruby port has less time in contact with wood, and it can be made in different ways. It's really about the freshness of the raw ingredients. You then get to tawny ports, which are then aged in smaller casks, and part of what you're wanting to do there is the influence of the cask and also the oxidation effect of that maturation. You then also have vintages, or what we call colheita casks, which would be a single year of production that then captures that particular nature there. So you have different styles of port that have different characteristics, and then you go into other categories such as white ports, for example. In terms of the casks themselves, they're called port pipes, but you can get different sizes. But port pipes traditionally have been in the region of 550 to 650 litres, in that range, typically 650 litres that have been used in the past. And usually the casks are quite thick, the wood itself. And you get a mixture of European and American oak that can be used, but largely, traditionally European oak in terms of production was used a lot. Really what you're looking for in the cask itself for producing port is largely that oxidative effect rather than necessarily the direct influence from the wood, dependent on the port producer as well.
So when you're then looking out to source port casks or port pipes for maturing the Dalmore, what is it that you're looking out for? What kind of cask do you want and is going to marry well?
So each individual cask and year of production has its own unique character to it. So we'll actually very purposefully select the individual port pipes for that project. So we go through each of those different ranges of styles, including some of the single vintages, the colheita casks. But largely what we're looking for is that beautiful weight. You get lovely sort of plum fruit qualities to it, a lot of weight, richness, particular dimensions you can pick up, nutty notes, coffee notes, as well as that sort of rich sweetness. So dependent on the individual Dalmore that we want to create, we would then select by hand and monitor over many years each of those individual different styles. So, a port cask is not just a port cask. A sherry cask is not just a sherry cask. There's so much more behind it, and that's part of our philosophy at the Dalmore. Is it's about excellence at every level of the process, and part of that is also the monitoring of these casks. So Richard and I, usually 2 times a year, we'll go and we'll be in the Dalmore warehousing, selecting individual releases for the future, but also monitoring these casks over time. You can sometimes monitor some of these port casks, and they'll really start to show something after even a year or two, but often we'll leave it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years beyond that. And as part of that, going back to the history of the Dalmore, and particularly what Richard has done there, is he's laid down all these beautiful casks for the future as well. So I've been very lucky to be working, closely with him and nurturing these wonderful expressions for many years to come.
Well, I'm thirsty now after that conversation. I mean, that's like, all that talk of port and Dalmore spirit. I definitely want to. Now, I actually happen to have some here because this is this particular whiskey is one that I tend to keep on hand, as I'm a big fan of it. So, but I'll let you lead the tasting. Now, talk me through, we've talked a bit about the kinds of port casks that you use, but what do you think they bring to the table for this particular expression, and how do you use them to create this expression?
So, particularly for this one, what's key are our 10-year-old tawny port casks. So, generally, tawny port, what that means is that it's spent a significant time in smaller sized casks or port pipes. But for this particular one, we've sourced from our friends at Graham's Port. So that's a partnership that we've had for many, many decades in terms of being able to select not just the right fortified wine, it's also the right partner in terms of the producer and also style and individual cask selection. So here, this is the main influence from that port is coming from this Graham's 10-year-old tawny port. Now, what you should find is on the nose, you get this beautiful sort of red berry quality that comes through, as well as that plummy note that I talked about, and even even some of the signature citrus notes, Seville orange, burnt orange rind as well tends to come through. But there's still a freshness to it. So this is the benefit of utilising particular tawny ports, is you can get tawny ports of different ages, but at 10 years, the Graham's port really still has a lot of life to it and vibrancy. And this is, for me, this is I think the one that I enjoy the most of out of the Dalmore. So if you classify that as your favourite in terms of frequency, it's certainly the one that I keep going back to, because I find lots of different dimensions in there, but it's something that you can sit and it can be a contemplative sort of dram, as we're doing in our living rooms, or me in our sample room today. But also it's something you can share with friends, and it's really an uplifting sort of style. So I tend to get that. I mean, even on the nose, you get that red berry, the plums, and the richness. There's a slight bit of almost like sweet ginger note that's there, almost like caramelized or crystallized ginger you get particularly on the nose. Now, this is at a higher ABV that we've purposefully selected for this. So this is 46.5%. And part of that is to retain that richness, that roundness of the influence of the port itself. Now, any whiskey maker and any custodian of a single malt distillery, our role is, in our maturation policy and our cask enhancement, is it's called enhancement for a purpose. Because it's all about bringing out the life of that spirit that we've made at the distillery itself, as well as anything else. So what we don't want to do is mask that beautiful richness and body from the distillery itself. But the life of the Portwood Reserve starts in American white oak, as I've mentioned before, and then what we're doing here is then an enhancement or a finishing for part of the recipe with these beautiful 10-year-old tawny port casks. So then moving on to from the nose to the tasting here, really, and Richard would explain the same thing, it's really about giving the whiskey plenty of time. So part of the sort of sensory experience is time to enjoy the whiskey itself. But So here you can tell it's a really rich, beautiful, rounded style of spirit, and you're picking up some of those beautiful citrusy notes, almost like sort of nectarine qualities. You're getting that red berry fruit, the plums, the richness. You know, if you're a lover of quality ports, this is really a great way to enjoy both a beautiful whiskey style, but also the influence of the port. And it's quite direct, but still at the same time being balanced and within our house style. Our house style at Dalmore, we have these lovely rich orange notes, chocolate, and spiced characteristics. And that's something you'll pick up in here as well. You'll get all of those elements, but within different dimensions. So I get lovely, coffee notes and beautiful toffee notes. The plum is transforming almost into some fig notes also in the background and the aftertaste. There's caramel notes, vanilla, real vanilla pods, Madagascan vanilla. But it's still got, again, that vibrancy, that freshness to it. You can tell that it's born partly of the beauty of grape, and grapes and beautiful port styles. But with age, so you can tell there's an antique quality that's in the background to that. So for many of you who are maybe newer to the Dalmore, this really does give you an indication of both how you can get the balanced freshness coming from the Dalmore, but also that rich, deep intensity that's born from our dedicated selection to these individual casks that we're using.
Yeah, I definitely think there's something that's wonderful about it is that port casks port pipes can sometimes overwhelm a whiskey a little bit, and you can, and I've had more than a couple of port matured whiskies that I just haven't got on with at all because the oxidatively driven flavors have sort of completely taken over everything, and it's sort of it becomes very nutty. You start getting some of these more like umami, mushroomy notes, which in moderation can be nice, but sometimes can completely take over and really dominate. People talk about rancio sometimes with pork with port casks as depending on the type, and that can be nice, as you say, in moderation, but very easy to let it go wild. And what I really love about this particular expression is the port casks are used as a sort of enhancer, as a way of lifting things and introducing these red, or dialing up these sort of red berry notes without completely steamrolling the spirit. There's still lots of Dalmore DNA in here.
Absolutely. When we're constructing or building a recipe, we're very much thinking about who's going to be enjoying it, and what we like to do is build in this complexity to it, and the ability for individual people to pick out their own individual notes out of a whiskey of great depth, such as this. So for those who are looking for a slight element of that, as you point out, that rancio or umami quality, you might pick up a little bit more in the background here, rather than particular, as you say, some of the older styles, it might be more to the fore. But the beauty of aged tawny is you can play in both fields. You can have that beautiful freshness, vibrancy, uplifting nature, but also in the background, as you train your palate, or those who have very good palates, you can start to pick out all of these different elements, and it's all within that house style that we have at the Dalmore, that richness, the fruitiness, the orange notes, the chocolate notes, and the spice, and they all can live within an individual whiskey without tasting samey, as it were. You want to have that difference and uniqueness as you're exploring the entire Dalmore range.
Now, I think if you're going to talk about port casks and Dalmore, it's probably worth us mentioning a rather special whiskey that was released in early 2020 to mark a special occasion that used Colita pork pipes. So perhaps share a little bit about that particular release.
So for to celebrate our 180th anniversary of the Dalmore Distillery, we brought out a 51-year-old Dalmore, and as part of that recipe, we actually utilised some Colheita port pipes from Graham's again, but that was going back to 1938. So it shows you that the selection that we're doing for these individual years can go way back many, many decades. So this was a really unique project that we put together specifically for the anniversary of the distillery itself. And that was a really good example of an older Colheita style that gave you more of those unusual qualities of, for example, the umami notes and the rancio notes, but in very much a positive, balanced way. And we also utilized other elements such as Methuselah sherry within that recipe, and also American oak to balance out some of these elements. Because to your earlier point, often you can use a cask type which will then start to mask some of the nuances of what the distillery is really about. And that particular 51-year-old, which was only 51 bottles produced of that, is a unique project that will never be replicated, and partly because of the rarity of those Colheita port casks.
So for those of people who are watching this who have enjoyed this sample of the Dalmore Port Wood Reserve, is this generally available? Does it sit as part of the core range?
Yeah, so this one you'll find out there in the market. It's around about the UK prices are around about £65, something on those lines. So it's actually for me, what's great is it's got an accessibility to it in terms of coming into the Dalmore range, and it sits beautifully there with the quality of the casks that we're creating. That higher ABV, just over 46%, is really all about delivering a unique set of flavors. And for me, even before I got into Scotch whisky, I had a great love for port. So that's what one of my first loves in terms of the wine world, and for me this is one of my favourite expressions of the Dalmore, but also something that many people can get a hold of and really experience that depth, complexity, richness, boldness and uniqueness of the Dalmore style. So I hope everyone's enjoying it.
Definitely. And what about it, sort of getting in touch or following Dalmore online? Is there places that people can find more information?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a great website which goes through our different ranges, a little bit more about the long history that we have at the Dalmore Distillery, and obviously you can certainly find on YouTube some interesting videos that Richard's done out there when he's been traveling around the world. So that's a really great experience for those of you who are maybe newer into the Dalmore. Is well worth looking at. Well worth looking at the our website, and also some of the videos that are there with Richard too.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and knowledge of this of the Dalmore and this particularly lovely whiskey. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll be having a dram in person sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Slàinte.
Cheers. Have a good one.